What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. It's Ryan here on the Max Afterburner channel. I'm a former F-15E combat fighter pilot, former F-16 Thunderbird pilot, and I've flown Boeing 737s and Airbus A220s as an airline pilot for years. And today we're covering a really significant break in what had been a brief, fragile pause in this conflict. Iran launched a barrage of ballistic missiles at a U.S. base in Jordan, and the United States responded almost immediately, teaming up with Saudi Arabia to strike Iranian-backed militias in Iraq. I want to walk you through exactly what happened, why this specific attack matters so much given the timing, how the interception actually worked from a technical standpoint, and then give you my honest read on what this means for the fragile diplomatic track that had just started to show some signs of progress. So my goal today is a few things. First, I want to lay out the sequence of events here clearly, because this happened fast and there are a lot of moving pieces. Second, I want to break down the intercept side of this because every single missile Iran launched was reportedly stopped. And I think that's worth understanding technically rather than just accepting as a headline. And third, I want to give you my honest opinion on what this specific attack and the American and Saudi response to it signals about where this conflict is actually heading from here, especially given that this happened right in the middle of an active diplomatic push. Let's start with the sequence of events. Early Wednesday, Iran launched multiple ballistic missiles toward a U.S. military base in Jordan in what U.S. Central Command described as an attempted surprise attack. Every single missile involved was intercepted, and Jordan's own military separately confirmed that its air defenses intercepted and brought down 5 missiles that had been launched from Iranian territory. This is genuinely significant because of when it happened. This marks Iran's first ballistic missile attack against a U.S. base in the region since President Trump had paused strikes against Iran just days earlier on the prior Friday, specifically to give diplomacy another chance to work. So you had a real, if fragile, pause in the fighting, and this attack broke that pause almost immediately. Trump's reaction to this was about as blunt and direct as it gets. He told Fox News that the U.S. was going to, in his words, beat the absolute hell out of them, and separately vowed retribution after the attack. He'd also told Axios just the day before this happened that the U.S. was in what he called very deep talks with Iran, but warned he would return to very strong military action if diplomacy failed. And when asked how much time he was willing to give those negotiations, his answer was simply, not much time. So even before this missile attack happened, the diplomatic window was already being described in pretty tight terms by the president himself, and this attack essentially forced the exact decision point he'd already been signaling was coming. The American and Saudi response came quickly. Central Command said that U.S. and Saudi fighter aircraft struck multiple logistics and weapon sites in eastern Iraq, and framed this specifically as a response to more than 30 IRGC-directed drone attacks against American forces over the prior 72 hours. Not just this one missile barrage in isolation. Saudi Arabia's defense ministry confirmed its own participation in these strikes, describing them as coordinated directly with Central Command. According to NPR's reporting on this, the joint strikes killed at least 20 fighters tied to Iran-backed militia groups operating in Iraq. Central Command also put out a pointed statement afterward, saying the IRGC and its, in their words, terrorist proxies must cease these attacks to avoid further U.S. military response. And separately noted, there had been more than 600 attempted attacks on American citizens and facilities in Iraq by Iran-aligned militias just between February and April of this year, which gives you a sense of just how sustained and how large-scale this proxy conflict inside Iraq has actually been running, well before this specific missile attack made headlines. I also want to mention the broader regional picture here, because this attack didn't happen in isolation. On the same general time frame, Saudi Arabia reported shooting down drones fired by Iran-backed militias in Iraq for a second consecutive day, and Iran-backed Houthi rebels in Yemen separately claimed to have forced a Saudi oil tanker to turn around as part of what they've described as their own self-styled blockade of the kingdom. So you've got Iran's proxy network active on multiple fronts simultaneously, ballistic missiles at a U.S. base in Jordan, drone attacks against Saudi Arabia from Iraq, and a Houthi maritime blockade attempt against Saudi shipping, all happening at roughly the same time, which tells you this wasn't some isolated one-off provocation. It's part of a broader, coordinated pressure campaign being run across multiple proxy forces at once. Now here's where the story gets genuinely complicated, because this attack happened right in the middle of what had actually looked like real diplomatic progress. An Iranian official had told CBS News just days before that talks between Iranian and Omani officials over the prior weekend had been constructive, with discussions specifically aimed at reopening the Strait of Hormuz, described as moving in a positive direction. The U.S. ambassador to the United Nations had described the pause in strikes as being about giving diplomacy some space, while simultaneously stressing that more U.S. military assets were continuing to move into the region, and delivering a pointed warning that the regime should believe the president when he says they're locked and loaded. So even during this diplomatic opening, the American posture was clearly one of continued pressure and continued military buildup running in parallel with the talks, not a genuine stand-down. I also want to mention that Iran's own Revolutionary Guard Navy had, just before this missile attack, stopped 6 vessels attempting to transit the Strait of Hormuz through routes that hadn't been approved by Iranian authorities, according to Iranian state television. That's a meaningful detail, because it shows Iran was still actively asserting control and disrupting normal shipping through that critical waterway, even during the period when diplomatic talks about reopening the strait were supposedly showing positive momentum, which tells you the actual situation on the water remained tense and contested, regardless of what was happening at the negotiating table. There's also a separate connected thread worth mentioning here, tying back to something else going on in the region at the same time. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov commented on Ukraine's recent strike on an Iranian commercial vessel in the Caspian Sea, describing it as an assault on Iran, referring to that weekend strike which killed 1 sailor and wounded another. So you've got Russia publicly weighing in and characterizing that separate Ukraine-Iran incident in a way that's clearly sympathetic to Iran's position, which fits into that broader pattern we've talked about before on this channel of the Russia-Iran relationship deepening, and these separate regional conflicts increasingly becoming entangled with each other. Let's talk about the intercept side of this attack, because I think this deserves real technical attention, since every single missile fired at that base in Jordan was reportedly stopped. Ballistic missile defense against an attack like this typically relies on a layered system, ground-based radar detecting the launch and tracking the missile's trajectory almost immediately after liftoff. That tracking data getting fed into a command and control network that calculates an intercept solution. And then interceptor missiles, systems like Patriot batteries positioned specifically to defend high-value targets like a military base, getting launched to physically destroy the incoming missile before it can reach its target. Ballistic missiles travel at extremely high speeds, especially in the terminal phase of their flight as they come back down toward the target. So successfully intercepting, one requires extremely precise split-second timing and coordination between the radar tracking system and the interceptor missile's own guidance. Getting a 100% intercept rate against multiple missiles launched simultaneously, which is what's being reported here, both at the Jordan base and separately with Jordan's own military, intercepting the additional missiles headed toward its own territory, is a genuinely impressive technical achievement, and it reflects the substantial investment the U.S. and its regional partners have made in layered air and missile defense, specifically because of years of exactly this kind of threat from Iran and its proxies. I do want to give you some important context here too, because I don't want to make it sound like a perfect intercept record is guaranteed every single time an attack like this happens. There have been previous incidents in this broader conflict where Iranian missiles did get through, including an earlier attack on the same U.S. airbase in Jordan that killed 2 American service members in a missile and drone attack, which is referenced directly in the reporting on this most recent incident. So the fact that this particular barrage was fully intercepted is genuinely good news and reflects well on the defensive systems in place, but it's not something that can be assumed as a guaranteed outcome every single time. Air and missile defense, even with excellent systems and well-trained crews, is a probabilistic endeavor, not a perfect shield, and prior losses in the same conflict are a sober reminder of that reality. Let me take a few extra minutes to really dig into the missile defense technology here, because I think this is genuinely one of the most impressive parts of this entire story, and it deserves more attention than a passing mention. Patriot batteries, which are almost certainly a core part of the defensive network protecting a base like this one in Jordan, work by using a phased array radar system to detect and track incoming threats, then computing an intercept solution and launching a Patriot interceptor missile, designed to physically collide with the incoming threat, and what's called hit-to-kill technology, rather than exploding nearby and relying purely on blast fragmentation the way older generation surface-to-air missiles typically worked. Actually achieving that kind of direct hit against an incoming ballistic missile, which is itself moving at extremely high velocity, especially during the terminal phase of its flight path, requires an enormous amount of computing power, incredibly precise radar tracking, and split-second timing between detection, launch, and intercept, all happening within a window that's measured in seconds, not minutes. When you're defending against multiple missiles launched simultaneously, which appears to be exactly what happened here, the system also has to manage multiple simultaneous intercept solutions at once, prioritizing threats, avoiding wasting interceptors on missiles that are already off target or clearly going to miss, and making sure enough interceptor missiles remain available in the battery to handle the entire incoming salvo rather than running out partway through. I also want to mention the broader defensive network beyond just Patriot batteries specifically, because a base like this one typically has multiple overlapping layers of protection working together, Beyond ground-based Patriot systems, you often have naval assets in the region, destroyers equipped with the Aegis combat system and SM-3 or SM-6 interceptors, capable of providing an additional outer layer of ballistic missile defense, along with early warning satellites that can detect a missile launch from its heat signature within seconds of ignition, feeding that data into the broader command and control network well before ground-based radar would even pick up the missile on its own. All of that has to work together seamlessly, sharing tracking data across different services and different systems in real time for a full intercept success rate like what's being reported here to actually happen. That kind of integration takes years of investment, training, and exercises to get right. And I think 100% intercept success against a multi-missile salvo like this is a genuine testament to how much that layered system has matured over the years of this broader conflict. I also want to spend some time on the militia network in Iraq that these joint US and Saudi strikes specifically targeted, because I think understanding that network's history helps explain why Central Command's statement specifically called out that broader 72-hour window of drone attacks rather than treating this as an isolated response to just the missile attack itself. Iran-aligned militia groups in Iraq largely trace their organizational roots back to the Popular Mobilization Forces, a coalition that originally formed to fight against the Islamic State after it seized large sections of Iraqi territory back in 2014. Over time, the Iraqi government formally designated the PMF as an independent military formation within its own armed forces. But in practice, many of these individual militia groups retain significant autonomy from direct government control, operate with extensive backing, funding, and weapons support from Iran's IRGC, and have been responsible for a long, well-documented history of attacks against American forces stationed in Iraq, going back years before this current conflict with Iran even began. That existing infrastructure, established militia groups with real combat experience, extensive weapons stockpiles, and deep organizational ties to Iran's own military and intelligence apparatus, is exactly why Iran has been able to sustain this level of proxy pressure against American forces in Iraq for so long. It's not improvised on the fly. It's built on more than a decade of accumulated organizational capacity that long predates the current war. I also want to touch on something from my own perspective as someone who has flown combat missions in genuinely hostile airspace, because I think it's worth acknowledging what it actually takes to execute a joint strike operation like the one described here, hitting multiple logistics and weapon sites across eastern Iraq in coordination with a foreign partner air force, all within roughly a day of the missile attack that prompted it. Coordinating a joint strike package between two different countries' air forces requires an enormous amount of advanced planning around things like common communications protocols, deconflicting airspace, so aircraft from both countries don't interfere with or accidentally engage each other, and making sure both sides are working from the same targeting intelligence and rules of engagement. The fact that this response came together and executed this quickly tells me there was almost certainly already a substantial amount of pre-existing coordination and shared intelligence infrastructure in place between US and Saudi forces well before this specific attack happened. Since building that kind of joint targeting and execution capability from scratch in under 24 hours simply isn't realistic, even for two highly capable, well-resourced air forces. I also want to bring up something else that happened earlier this year that I think is relevant context for how seriously the US and its partners take the ballistic missile threat from Iran specifically. Back in March, Iran launched at least 2 intercontinental ballistic missiles toward the island of Diego Garcia in the British Indian Ocean Territory, a critical US and UK military base. Neither missile actually struck the target. One failed during flight. The other was intercepted by an SM-3 interceptor launched from a US warship. Iran denied responsibility for that attack at the time, calling it a false flag operation, though Israel separately claimed the strikes had occurred and pointed out that weapons with that kind of range would also have the capability to reach targets in Europe. That earlier incident, involving actual intercontinental range missiles rather than the shorter range ballistic missiles used in this most recent Jordan attack, tells you Iran has demonstrated a genuinely long-range strike capability at multiple points throughout this conflict, not just the more regionally focused attacks we've seen against bases in Jordan and Iraq. I also want to touch on the economic dimension of missile defense here, because it's an aspect that doesn't get talked about enough given how much attention the tactical side of these engagements usually gets. Interceptor missiles like the ones used in Patriot batteries are genuinely expensive, often costing several $millions per unit depending on the specific variant, while the ballistic missiles Iran is launching, though certainly not cheap themselves, are typically produced at a lower cost than the interceptors used to stop them. That cost asymmetry means every successful intercept, while operationally excellent news in terms of protecting American and partner forces, still represents a real, ongoing financial cost that adds up considerably over a sustained conflict involving repeated missile salvos like the one we've seen throughout this war. That's part of why you'll sometimes hear defense analysts raise concerns about interceptor stockpile levels during a prolonged conflict like this one, since production of these sophisticated interceptor systems takes real time and manufacturing capacity to replenish, and a sustained campaign of repeated attacks, even with a perfect intercept record, still draws down those stockpiles with every single engagement. I also want to mention the diplomatic complexity of the Jordan and Saudi Arabia relationship in all of this, because I think it's worth understanding why these two countries in particular have become such central players in the American response to Iran's regional proxy network. Jordan has long maintained a close security relationship with the United States, hosting American forces and serving as a key partner for regional stability efforts, while also trying to maintain its own delicate balancing act given its geographic position bordering multiple countries directly involved in various regional conflicts. Saudi Arabia, meanwhile, has its own long-running direct conflict with Iran's proxy network, primarily through the Houthi conflict in Yemen, which gives Riyadh a strong independent motivation to participate in strikes against Iran-aligned militias in Iraq, beyond simply supporting American interests. When you see a joint American and Saudi strike package like the one described here, that reflects both countries pursuing genuinely aligned interests, degrading the same broader Iranian proxy network that threatens both American forces directly and Saudi Arabia's own security and shipping interests simultaneously, rather than Saudi Arabia simply acting as a junior partner doing America a favor. Let me also mention how this specific incident fits into the broader pattern of how this entire war has unfolded since it first began back in February, with the initial coordinated Israeli and American strikes against Iranian nuclear infrastructure and military leadership. Throughout the months since then, we've seen this same basic cycle repeat itself over and over. Periods of intense strikes, followed by attempts at diplomatic engagement or temporary pauses, followed by some triggering incident, whether that's an attack on shipping, a strike on a specific facility, or in this case, a direct missile attack on a US base that reignites the cycle all over again. I think recognizing that recurring pattern is important context for understanding this specific incident, because it suggests we're not dealing with some entirely novel escalation. We're watching the same fundamental dynamic that's driven this entire conflict since February play out yet again, just with the specific details. This time, a Jordan-based missile attack breaking a diplomacy-focused pause, changing from one cycle to the next. Let me give you my honest opinion on all of this, because I think there's a really important strategic pattern worth understanding here. This attack, breaking a pause that had only been in place for a matter of days, specifically established to give diplomacy room to work, tells me that whatever constructive progress was reportedly happening in the Iran and Oman talks about reopening the strait, it clearly wasn't enough to convince Iran's military and IRGC leadership to actually stand down their broader proxy and missile campaign in the meantime. That's a pattern we've unfortunately seen repeat itself throughout this entire conflict. Diplomatic progress on one track running in parallel with continued military action on another, rather than the two being coordinated in a way that actually leads to a genuine comprehensive stand-down. I think that disconnect between what negotiators are discussing at the table and what IRGC-aligned forces are actually doing on the ground and in the air at the same time is one of the most persistent obstacles to actually ending this war, because it suggests Iran's own government may not have full, unified control over every element of its own military and proxy apparatus, or alternatively, that Iran is deliberately using continued military pressure as leverage to try to extract better terms at the negotiating table, even while talks are supposedly progressing constructively. I also think the specific framing Central Command used here matters a lot, tying this response not just to the missile attack on the Jordan base, but to that broader pattern of more than 30 IRGC-directed drone attacks over the preceding 72 hours. That tells me the American response wasn't purely reactive to one single incident. It was aimed at the broader network of militia and proxy activity that's been sustaining pressure against American forces in Iraq for months now, which fits the same pattern I've talked about before on this channel of the US, preferring to target the actual infrastructure and networks enabling repeated attacks, rather than just responding to each individual strike in isolation. Let me also talk about what I think happens next, because I know that's really what everybody watching this wants to understand. Given how quickly and how forcefully the US and Saudi Arabia responded here, hitting multiple logistics and weapon sites, and reportedly killing at least 20 militia fighters within roughly a day of the missile attack, I think we should expect Iran's aligned proxy forces to face real, immediate pressure to either escalate further or genuinely pull back. And given the pattern we've seen throughout this entire conflict of continued escalation rather than sustained restraint, I lean toward expecting further exchanges in the very near term, rather than a quick return to the kind of calm that had briefly existed before this attack. That said, the fact that Iran itself was reportedly still engaged in what were described as constructive talks with Oman just days before this happened tells me there's still at least some genuine appetite on the Iranian side for a diplomatic path forward, even if their own military and proxy forces don't appear to be fully aligned with that diplomatic track in practice. I also want to touch on Jordan's role in all of this because I think it's easy to lose sight of the fact that Jordan itself is directly in the blast radius of this conflict. Quite literally, given that missiles were fired directly at its territory and at a base located within its borders. Jordan's military independently confirmed intercepting 5 missiles headed toward its own airspace, which means Jordan isn't just hosting American forces as a bystander in this war. Its own air defense systems and its own territory are being directly targeted as part of this broader campaign against the American presence in the region. That's consistent with the pattern we've talked about on this channel before with other Gulf host nations like Kuwait, countries that didn't choose to be combatants in this conflict, but have ended up directly in the line of fire because of their relationship with American forces stationed on their soil. I also want to acknowledge, before wrapping up, the American and Jordanian personnel who were on the receiving end of this attack, because behind every headline about 100% intercept rate, there were real service members on that base who spent those minutes not knowing for certain whether the defensive systems would hold. And that's a genuinely stressful, high-stakes experience, regardless of how the engagement ultimately turned out. So here's my bottom line on all of this. Iran's missile attack on the U.S. base in Jordan, breaking a pause that had only existed for a matter of days specifically to give diplomacy room to work, and the extremely rapid, coordinated American and Saudi response hitting Iranian-aligned militia targets in Iraq tells me this conflict remains deeply unstable even during periods that look on the surface like genuine diplomatic progress. The fact that every single missile in this specific attack was successfully intercepted is genuinely good news and reflects real investment and real capability in layered missile defense. But the underlying pattern, diplomatic talks proceeding on one track while military and proxy pressure continues essentially uninterrupted on another, tells me we shouldn't read this brief pause or its rapid collapse as any kind of reliable signal about where this conflict is actually headed in the near term. My honest expectation, given how this entire war has played out over the past several months, is continued exchanges of this kind, attacks, successful intercepts, and rapid retaliatory strikes, rather than a clean, lasting return to either full-scale open war or genuine, comprehensive peace. At least until something more fundamental changes in either Iran's internal command structure or in the broader diplomatic calculus driving these talks. I'll definitely keep tracking this story closely, because with Trump's own comments suggesting there's not much time left for diplomacy to work, I think we're going to get real clarity soon on which direction this actually goes. What do you guys think? Do you think this attack effectively kills the diplomatic track for good? Or do you think both sides still find their way back to the table despite this? Let me know down in the comments. I read every single one of them. If this helped you understand what's actually happening with this story, go ahead and hit that like button for me, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next update, and follow me on X and Instagram, where I'm posting on this pretty much daily as it develops. Links in the description below. And go ahead and check out the video right here. I think you'll enjoy it. This is Ryan, also known as Max Afterburner, also known as the fighter pilot next door, signing off.